Sarah Williams stood at her kitchen window, watching the morning mist rise from the valley below. At 35, she had learned that life could change in an instant. 3 months ago, her husband, Mark, had died in a car accident, leaving her alone with their 2 children, Emma, age 12, and Jason, age 9. The house felt too quiet now, filled with memories and the weight of decisions she never thought she'd have to make alone. The ranch had been in Mark's family for 3 generations. 500 acres of rolling hills and fertile land in Northern California, where the Modoc people had lived for thousands of years before settlers arrived. Mark had always respected that history, often speaking about the indigenous families who still lived in the area and maintained their traditions despite centuries of hardship. Sarah's financial situation was becoming desperate. The medical bills from Mark's final weeks in the hospital had drained their savings. The ranch required constant maintenance, and without Mark's income from his job at the lumber mill, she was struggling to keep up with the mortgage payments. The bank had already sent 2 warning letters. That morning, as she prepared breakfast for Emma and Jason, Sarah noticed an unfamiliar truck pulling up their long gravel driveway. A Native American man in his 60s stepped out, his weathered face kind but serious. She recognized him as Thomas Crowfeather, a respected elder from the local Modoc community. Mark had spoken of him often with great admiration. Thomas knocked gently on the front door. When Sarah opened it, he removed his hat and spoke quietly. "Mrs. Williams, I heard about Mark's passing. He was a good man who always treated our people with respect. I'm sorry for your loss." Sarah invited him in for coffee. As they sat at her kitchen table, Thomas explained that he had come with an unusual proposal. His own family had faced tragedy recently. His daughter-in-law had died in childbirth, leaving his son David devastated and unable to care for their newborn baby. The infant had been placed temporarily with relatives, but David was drowning in grief and struggling with alcoholism. "Our traditions are old," Thomas said, looking directly into Sarah's eyes. "In the past, when families faced such hardships, sometimes arrangements were made to help everyone survive. I know this might sound strange to you, but I want to propose something that could help both our families." Sarah listened carefully as Thomas explained his idea. He knew about her financial troubles through mutual friends in their small community. He also knew that she was a good mother and a strong woman. His proposal was this. If Sarah would agree to marry his son David, Thomas would pay off her ranch mortgage and provide ongoing financial support. It would be a practical arrangement that would give David a reason to heal and give Sarah the security she needed to raise her children. "David is a good man," Thomas assured her. "He's 28 years old, works as a mechanic, and before his wife's death he was responsible and kind. The grief has made him lose his way, but having a family to care for might bring him back to himself." Sarah was shocked by the proposal. Marriage to a stranger seemed impossible to consider. Yet as she looked around her kitchen, seeing the stack of unpaid bills on the counter and remembering the repo notice she'd hidden from the children, she couldn't dismiss the offer immediately. Thomas seemed to understand her hesitation. "You don't have to answer today," he said. "But I want you to know that this would be respected in our community. You would be treated with honor, and your children would be welcomed as part of our family. David has land of his own adjacent to yours. Together the properties would make a strong foundation for the future." After Thomas left, Sarah sat alone in her kitchen, her mind racing. The proposal seemed like something from another century, yet she couldn't ignore the practical benefits. Her children's stability was her primary concern, and she was running out of options to provide for them. That evening, she drove to the cemetery where Mark was buried. Standing beside his grave, she spoke aloud to him, asking for guidance. The wind rustled through the oak trees overhead, and she remembered something Mark had once told her about the Modoc people's wisdom in creating families through alliance, rather than just romance. When she returned home, Emma was waiting up for her. Her daughter had always been perceptive, sensing when something was troubling her mother. "Mom, are we going to lose the ranch?" Emma asked quietly. Sarah sat beside her daughter on the couch and chose her words carefully. "I'm working on some solutions, sweetheart. We may have to make some big changes, but I promise you that we'll stay together as a family. And I'll do everything I can to make sure you and Jason are safe and cared for." Emma nodded, trusting her mother, but clearly worried. After tucking both children into bed, Sarah spent the night walking through the house, remembering her life with Mark and trying to imagine a future she had never planned. The next morning brought another visit, this time from David Crowfeather himself. Sarah watched from her window as he approached the house slowly, his hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets. Even from a distance, she could see the sadness that seemed to weigh down his shoulders. When she opened the door, David looked up at her with dark eyes that held deep pain, but also a quiet dignity. "Mrs. Williams," he said softly, "my father told me about his conversation with you yesterday. I wanted to come and speak with you myself before you make any decision." Sarah invited him in, studying this man who might become her husband. David was tall and lean, with calloused hands that spoke of honest work. His face was handsome but marked by grief, and when he spoke, his voice carried a gentleness that reminded her somehow of Mark. "I want you to know," David said, sitting awkwardly at her kitchen table, "that I would never expect this to be a real marriage unless that's what you wanted. My father's idea comes from old ways, but I understand that you're a modern woman with your own feelings and needs. If you agreed to this arrangement, I would respect your space and your independence." Sarah appreciated his directness. They talked for over an hour, and she found herself surprised by David's intelligence and sensitivity. He spoke about his late wife with love, but without the desperate clinging to the past that she had feared. He also talked about his struggles with drinking since her death, admitting honestly that he needed something to live for again. As David prepared to leave, he turned back to Sarah with a question that would haunt her for days. "Do you think it's possible," he asked, "for two people who have both lost everything to build something new together, even if it starts as just survival?" Sarah didn't have an answer, but she promised to consider everything carefully. As she watched David drive away, she realized that her decision would affect not just her own future, but the futures of 4 people who had all been wounded by loss and were searching for a way forward. The decision tortured Sarah for a week. She found herself unable to eat, lying awake at night staring at the ceiling while her mind spun through every possible outcome. The practical side of her knew that Thomas's offer was the answer to her financial prayers. The mortgage would be paid, her children would have security, and the ranch would remain in their lives. But the emotional side of her recoiled at the idea of marrying someone she barely knew, someone who was still grieving his own lost love. Sarah decided she needed to learn more about David before making such a life-changing choice. She began asking subtle questions around town, speaking with people who knew the Crowfeather family. What she learned surprised her. Before his wife's death, David had been known as one of the most reliable and kind-hearted men in the community. He volunteered at the tribal youth center, helped elderly neighbors with repairs to their homes, and was studying part-time to become a certified automotive engineer. The drinking problem had started only after the tragedy. His wife Maria had died from complications during childbirth, and their baby had lived for just 6 hours before passing away as well. David had lost his entire future family in one devastating day. According to those who knew him, he had stopped eating, stopped working, and started spending his days at the local bar, drowning his pain in alcohol. Mrs. Peterson, who ran the general store in town, pulled Sarah aside one afternoon. "That boy was devoted to Maria," she said quietly. "I've never seen a man love a woman the way David loved her. When she died, it was like watching someone's soul get torn in half. But before all that happened, he was the kind of man any woman would be lucky to have." Sarah also learned about the Crowfeather family's standing in the community. Thomas was a respected tribal elder who had worked for decades to preserve Modoc traditions, while also helping his people adapt to modern life. He had served on the tribal council for 20 years, and was known for his wisdom in settling disputes. The family owned considerable land and had built a successful business raising cattle and horses. One evening, Sarah made a decision that surprised even herself. She called Thomas and asked if she could visit David's property to see where she and her children might be living if she accepted the proposal. Thomas agreed immediately and offered to accompany her. David's land lay in a beautiful valley 3 miles from Sarah's ranch. As they drove up the dirt road leading to his house, Sarah was struck by how well-maintained everything appeared despite David's recent struggles. The fences were sturdy, the pastures were green and healthy, and cattle grazed peacefully in the distance. The house itself was a modest but well-built log home that David and his late wife had constructed together over several years. Thomas explained that they had planned to expand it when children came, but those dreams had died with Maria and the baby. David met them at the front door, and Sarah could see he had made an effort to clean himself up for her visit. He was sober, freshly shaved, and wearing clean clothes. He showed her through the house with obvious pride, pointing out the features he and Maria had designed together. Sarah noticed that he spoke of his late wife naturally, without the desperate clinging she had worried about. Maria always wanted a big kitchen, David said, showing Sarah the spacious room with hand-built cabinets and a large window overlooking the mountains. She said the kitchen was the heart of a home, and families needed room to gather there. The house had 3 bedrooms, which would be perfect for Emma and Jason to have their own spaces. There was also a large workshop where David did mechanical work, and a barn that housed 2 horses and farm equipment. Everything spoke of a man who had once taken great care in building a life, even if that life had been shattered. As they walked through the property, Thomas shared more about Modoc traditions regarding marriage and family. In our culture, he explained, marriage has always been about creating alliances between families, about survival and mutual support. Love can grow from respect and shared purpose. Some of the strongest marriages in our community began as practical arrangements that became deep partnerships over time. Sarah found herself imagining Emma and Jason playing in the large yard, riding the gentle horses, and having space to grow up safely away from town. The property felt peaceful and solid, unlike her own ranch, which was falling into disrepair due to lack of funds for maintenance. That evening, David asked if he could speak with Sarah privately. They sat on his front porch as the sun set behind the mountains, and he opened up about his struggles since Maria's death. "I want to be honest with you about the drinking," he said, looking directly at her. "It started because I couldn't handle the pain, but I know it's destroying me. If you decide to go through with this arrangement, I promise you that I'll get the help I need. I've already started attending meetings at the tribal center, and my father has agreed to be my sponsor." David also shared something that surprised Sarah. "I know this might sound strange, but Maria and I talked about adoption before she got pregnant. We wanted to help children who needed families. In a way, if you say yes to this, I'd be honoring something she and I dreamed about together." Sarah felt something shift inside her as she listened to David speak. She began to see him not as a stranger she might have to marry, but as a fellow survivor who was trying to find a way forward after devastating loss. Like her, he was someone who had had his life torn apart and was struggling to rebuild. On the drive home, Thomas made one final appeal. "Sarah, I know this seems like an impossible decision, but I've lived long enough to know that sometimes the best things in life come from the most unexpected places. You and David are both good people who deserve happiness. Maybe you can find it together." That night, Sarah sat down with Emma and Jason to have the most difficult conversation of her life. She explained that she was considering marrying someone who could help their family stay together and keep the ranch. She was careful not to make it sound like a business transaction, but she wanted them to understand that this would be a marriage based on mutual need rather than romance. Emma, wise beyond her 12 years, asked the question that had been haunting Sarah. "Mom, do you think you could learn to love him?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "I don't know, sweetheart, but I think he's a good man who has been through something terrible just like we have. Maybe we can help each other heal." Jason, who had been quiet during the conversation, finally spoke up. "Will he be nice to us? Will he try to replace Dad?" Sarah gathered both children close to her. "No one will ever replace your father," she said firmly. "But yes, I believe David would be kind to you. And if we do this, we'll all need to work together to become a new kind of family." The next morning, Sarah called Thomas and asked for one more meeting with David. This time, she wanted her children to meet him before she made her final decision. If they were going to become a family, Emma and Jason needed to feel comfortable with the man who might become their stepfather. The meeting was arranged for the following Sunday at David's house. As Sarah drove there with her children, she realized that she was no longer just considering a business arrangement. Somewhere in the conversations and visits of the past week, she had begun to hope that this strange proposal might actually lead to something real and meaningful for all of them. Sunday afternoon arrived with bright sunshine and a warm breeze that made the valley look like something from a postcard. Sarah felt her stomach churning with nerves as she drove toward David's house with Emma and Jason in the back seat. Both children had been unusually quiet during the 20-minute drive, and she knew they were as anxious as she was about this meeting. David was waiting on his front porch when they arrived, and Sarah could see that he had put considerable thought into this day. He had cleaned the house thoroughly, prepared a simple lunch, and even picked wildflowers for the kitchen table. Most importantly, he appeared completely sober and alert, his dark eyes clear and focused. Emma was the first to speak when they got out of the car. "You have really pretty horses," she said, looking toward the pasture where two chestnut mares were grazing peacefully. David smiled, and Sarah noticed how the expression transformed his entire face. "Would you like to meet them?" he asked. "Their names are Star and Luna. They're very gentle and they love children." Jason perked up immediately. He had always been fascinated by animals but had never had the chance to interact with horses. "Can we pet them?" he asked excitedly. The next hour passed more easily than Sarah had dared to hope. David proved to be wonderful with children, patient and encouraging as he taught Emma and Jason how to approach the horses safely. He showed them how to offer carrots on flat palms, how to brush the horses' coats, and how to read the animal's body language. "Horses are a lot like people," David explained to Jason as the 9-year-old carefully brushed Star's neck. "They can sense if you're scared or angry or sad, but if you're calm and kind, they'll be your friend forever." Sarah watched from the fence, amazed by how naturally David interacted with her children. There was no awkwardness, no sense that he was trying too hard to impress them. He simply treated them with the same gentle respect he showed the horses. After the horse visit, David invited them inside for lunch. He had prepared grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup, simple food that he knew children would enjoy. As they ate, he asked Emma and Jason about school, their friends and their interests. He listened carefully to their answers and asked thoughtful follow-up questions. Emma, who had been somewhat reserved at first, began to open up when David mentioned that he had built most of the furniture in the house himself. "I like making things too," she said. "I'm learning to knit and I want to learn woodworking like my dad used to do." David's eyes lit up. "I'd be happy to teach you some basic woodworking if you're interested. I have a workshop out back with all the tools we'd need. Of course, that would only be if..." He glanced at Sarah, not wanting to presume anything about their future. Jason was fascinated by David's work as a mechanic. "Can you fix any kind of car?" he asked. "Mom's truck makes a weird noise sometimes." "I'd be glad to take a look at it," David replied. Sometimes a weird noise is just something simple that needs attention. As the afternoon progressed, Sarah found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't experienced since Mark's death. The house felt warm and welcoming, and David's quiet competence was reassuring. She could see Emma and Jason beginning to feel comfortable with him, which was the most important thing to her. After lunch, David suggested they walk around the property so the children could see everything. He showed them the workshop where he repaired cars and built furniture, the chicken coop where a dozen hens provided fresh eggs daily, and the vegetable garden that was just beginning to sprout with spring plants. "Maria started this garden," David said as they walked among the neat rows. "She said store-bought vegetables never tasted as good as ones you grew yourself. I've tried to keep it going because she was right about that." Emma knelt down to examine the tiny green shoots pushing up through the soil. "What kinds of vegetables are these?" she asked. David pointed out tomatoes, peppers, squash, and beans. "There's enough space here to grow most of what a family needs for the whole year," he said. "Maria always planned to teach our children how to garden. She believed kids should know where their food comes from." Sarah noticed that David spoke about his late wife naturally, and without the heavy sadness she had seen during their first meeting. It seemed that having children around was indeed helping him find a path forward from his grief. The turning point of the day came when Jason spotted a small wooden toy truck sitting on David's workshop bench. "Did you make that?" he asked with obvious admiration. David nodded, looking slightly embarrassed. "I was working on it before everything happened. It was supposed to be for my son." His voice caught slightly on the last words. Jason looked up at David with the serious expression that sometimes made him seem older than his 9 years. "I'm sorry your baby died," he said quietly. "Our dad died too, and it makes everything really sad." David knelt down to Jason's eye level, and Sarah saw tears forming in his eyes. "Thank you for saying that," he said softly. "Yes, it does make everything really sad. But do you know what I've learned? Sometimes sad people can help each other feel a little bit better." Emma joined the conversation, moving closer to David and Jason. Mom says we might become a family with you, she said with typical 12-year-old directness. Would that help you feel less sad? David looked up at Sarah with a question in his eyes, and she nodded encouragingly. I think it might, he told Emma honestly. And I hope I could help you and Jason, and your mom feel less sad too. We'd all have to work together to make it happen. As the sun began to set, Sarah knew it was time to head home. The day had gone better than she had dared to hope, but she could see that Emma and Jason were getting tired, and she wanted to end the visit on a positive note. David walked them to their car, and Jason surprised everyone by giving him a spontaneous hug. I like your horses, he said. And I like you too. Emma was more reserved but equally positive. If we do become a family, she said seriously, I think it could work out okay. As Sarah started the truck, David leaned down to the driver's window. Thank you for bringing them today, he said. They're wonderful children. You should be very proud. I am, Sarah replied. And David, they seem to like you very much. That means everything to me. During the drive home, Emma and Jason chattered excitedly about the horses, the workshop, and the garden. Sarah listened to their enthusiasm and felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. For the first time since Mark's death, she could imagine a future that held hope and stability for her children. That night, after Emma and Jason were asleep, Sarah sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea and finally allowed herself to seriously consider saying yes to Thomas's proposal. The man she had met today was nothing like the broken, alcoholic stranger she had feared. David was kind, responsible, and clearly capable of caring for her children. More importantly, she sensed in him a deep loneliness that matched her own, and a desire to build something meaningful from the wreckage of their separate tragedies. The phone rang just as she was preparing for bed. It was David, and his voice was warm but hesitant. Sarah, I just wanted to call and thank you again for today. Your children are amazing, and spending time with them reminded me of things I thought I'd lost forever. They had a wonderful time, Sarah replied. Emma hasn't stopped talking about learning woodworking, and Jason wants to know when he can see the horses again. There was a pause before David spoke again. Sarah, I know you haven't made your decision yet, and I don't want to pressure you, but I want you to know that today gave me more hope than I've felt in months. Whatever you decide, I'm grateful for that gift. After hanging up the phone, Sarah realized that something fundamental had shifted during the day. She was no longer thinking about David as a stranger she might marry out of desperation. Instead, she was beginning to see him as a potential partner in building a new life that could honor both their pasts while creating something entirely different for the future. The decision came to Sarah 3 days later, while she was sorting through Mark's belongings in their bedroom closet. She had been putting off this painful task for months, but the bank's latest notice had arrived that morning, giving her just 2 weeks to bring the mortgage current or face foreclosure proceedings. As she folded Mark's shirts and placed them in donation boxes, Sarah found herself thinking about the conversation she'd had with Emma the night before. Her daughter had asked with typical directness whether Sarah thought Dad would want them to be happy, even if it meant living differently than they had planned. I think, Emma had said thoughtfully, that Dad would want us to be safe and together, and if marrying David keeps our family together, maybe that's what Dad would want too. The wisdom in her 12-year-old daughter's words struck Sarah deeply. Mark had always been practical above all else. He had bought life insurance to protect his family, saved money for emergencies, and made sure Sarah knew how to manage the ranch if anything happened to him. He had never planned on dying so young, but he had planned for his family's survival. That afternoon, Sarah called Thomas and asked him to arrange a meeting. She wanted to discuss the specific terms of the arrangement before giving her final answer. Thomas agreed immediately and suggested they meet at his house the following evening, with David present so all parties could be clear about expectations. Thomas's house was a comfortable blend of traditional and modern elements. Native American artwork and family photographs covered the walls, while practical furniture and modern appliances showed how the family balanced cultural traditions with contemporary life. Thomas's wife, Mary, greeted Sarah warmly and offered coffee and homemade bread. The conversation that followed was unlike anything Sarah had ever experienced. Thomas explained that in traditional Modoc culture, marriages were often arranged between families for mutual benefit, and that such arrangements frequently developed into strong, loving partnerships over time. The mistake people make today, Thomas said, is thinking that passion must come first. In our tradition, respect comes first, then partnership, and love grows from shared experiences and mutual care. David listened quietly as his father spoke, occasionally nodding but letting Thomas take the lead in explaining their proposal. When Sarah asked about specific expectations, David finally spoke up. "I want to be very clear about something," he said, looking directly at Sarah. "If you agree to this marriage, I won't expect us to share a bedroom immediately, or maybe ever, unless that's what you want. I understand that you loved Mark and I loved Maria. We both need time to figure out what this relationship might become." Thomas nodded approvingly at his son's words. "The house has 4 bedrooms," he added. "There's plenty of space for everyone to have privacy while still living as a family." They discussed practical matters for over an hour. Thomas would pay off Sarah's mortgage immediately upon the marriage, and would also provide a monthly allowance to cover household expenses and the children's needs. David would continue working as a mechanic, and Sarah would be free to pursue whatever work or activities she chose. "What about the children's education?" Sarah asked. This was one of her primary concerns. "They can continue at their current school if that's what they prefer," David replied. "Or they can transfer to the school closer to my house if that would be easier. I want them to feel like they have choices in how their lives change." Mary Crowfeather had been quiet during most of the discussion, but she spoke up when Sarah asked about how the community would view such an arrangement. "You'll be welcomed here," she said firmly. "David has been like a son lost in the wilderness since Maria died. Bringing him back to life by giving him a family to care for would be seen as a blessing, not something strange or wrong." As the evening progressed, Sarah found herself asking more practical questions and fewer emotional ones. Where would she and the children keep their belongings? How would household decisions be made? What would happen if the arrangement didn't work out? David and Thomas answered every question patiently and thoroughly. It became clear that they had thought through many of the potential complications and had reasonable solutions prepared. Most importantly, they both emphasized that Sarah would retain her independence and that the children's well-being would always be the top priority. Near the end of the meeting, Thomas asked Sarah if she needed more time to decide. She surprised herself by saying no. "I've made my decision," she said quietly. "If David is truly willing to take on the responsibility of raising Emma and Jason, and if he understands that this will be a partnership based on mutual respect rather than romantic love, then I accept your proposal." David's relief was visible, but he didn't smile or celebrate. Instead, he reached across the table and offered Sarah his hand. "I promise you," he said solemnly, "that I'll do everything in my power to be a good husband to you and a good stepfather to your children. I know I can't replace Mark, but I hope I can earn your respect and their trust." Sarah shook his hand, feeling as if she were signing a contract for a new life. "I promise the same," she replied. "I'll do my best to be a good wife and to help you heal from your losses." Thomas suggested they have a simple ceremony within the next 2 weeks, both to formalize the arrangement quickly and to give Sarah time to resolve her financial crisis. "We can have a traditional Modoc ceremony followed by a legal marriage at the courthouse," he proposed. "That way both cultures are honored." The next few days passed in a blur of activity. Sarah had to tell Emma and Jason about her decision, inform their schools about the upcoming changes, and begin the process of combining 2 households. She also had to face the difficult task of telling Mark's parents about her plans. Mark's mother, Helen, was initially shocked and hurt by Sarah's decision. "It's only been 3 months, she said tearfully during a phone call. "How can you even think about marrying someone else so soon?" Sarah had prepared for this reaction, but it still stung. "Helen, I'm not marrying David because I've stopped loving Mark or because I've found someone new to love. I'm marrying him because it's the only way I can keep Emma and Jason in a stable home and avoid losing everything Mark worked for." The conversation was painful, but eventually Helen began to understand Sarah's reasoning. "I just want you to promise me," Mark's mother said, "that you won't let this man try to erase Mark from the children's memories." "Never," Sarah assured her. "David understands that Mark will always be Emma and Jason's father. He's not trying to replace Mark. He's trying to help us build a different kind of future." Emma and Jason took the news better than Sarah had expected. Emma, especially, seemed relieved that the uncertainty was finally over. "So we'll get to live with the horses?" she asked excitedly. "And David will teach me woodworking?" Jason's main concern was whether he'd be able to visit his friends from school. When Sarah assured him that they would only be moving a few miles away, and that he could maintain his friendships, he seemed satisfied with the arrangement. The night before the wedding, Sarah sat alone in her bedroom, looking at the simple dress she had chosen for the ceremony. It wasn't white. That seemed inappropriate for a practical arrangement rather than a romantic union. Instead, she had selected a blue dress that Mark had always said brought out the color of her eyes. As she prepared for bed, Sarah realized that she wasn't feeling the terror she had expected. Instead, she felt a strange sense of calm, as if she were finally taking control of her life after months of feeling helpless. Tomorrow she would marry a man she barely knew, but she no longer saw David as a stranger. He was someone who, like her, had survived devastating loss and was trying to find a way forward. She thought about Maria, David's late wife, and wondered what she would think of this arrangement. Somehow Sarah believed that Maria would approve. Both women had loved deeply, lost tragically, and wanted the best for the children in their lives. If their situations had been reversed, Sarah thought she might have made the same choice Maria's family was making now. The last thing Sarah did before falling asleep was to write a letter to Mark, telling him about her decision and asking for his blessing. She sealed the letter in an envelope and placed it in the drawer with his wedding ring, knowing she would never send it, but needing to say the words anyway. The wedding ceremony took place on a crisp Saturday morning in late spring, held outdoors on the Crowfeather family's land. Sarah had never attended a traditional Modoc ceremony before, and she was moved by the beauty and solemnity of the rituals that Thomas performed as an elder of the tribe. About 30 people gathered in a circle among the oak trees, including several tribal elders, David's extended family, and a few close friends of both families. Emma and Jason stood beside Sarah, dressed in their best clothes and looking both nervous and excited about the day. Thomas began the ceremony by acknowledging the land and the ancestors who had lived there before them. He spoke in both Modoc and English, explaining that marriage was not just a union between two people, but a joining of families and communities. He talked about how difficult times sometimes required practical solutions, and how the strongest marriages were built on mutual respect and shared purpose. Today we witness Sarah and David choosing to create a new family from the pieces of their broken hearts, Thomas said, his voice carrying across the circle of witnesses. This is not a marriage born from passion, but from wisdom and necessity. Sometimes these prove to be the strongest unions of all. The traditional part of the ceremony included the exchange of gifts between families, prayers for prosperity and healing, and the sharing of bread and water to symbolize the couple's commitment to sustaining each other through all circumstances. When it came time for Sarah and David to speak their vows, they had decided to write their own words rather than use traditional wedding promises. Sarah went first, her voice steady despite her nervousness. David, I promise to be your partner in building a new life from the losses we've both suffered. I promise to respect your memory of Maria and to honor the love you shared with her. I promise to work alongside you in raising Emma and Jason with love and wisdom. I may not be able to offer you romantic love today, but I can offer you my commitment, my respect, and my willingness to create something meaningful together. David's vows were equally honest and practical. Sarah, I promise to care for you and your children as if you were my own family, because from today forward you will be. I promise to be patient as we all learn to live together and to never try to replace Mark and Emma and Jason's hearts. I promise to be the man you need me to be, and to earn your trust through my actions rather than just my words. The legal ceremony at the courthouse later that afternoon was much simpler, attended only by Thomas, Mary, Emma, and Jason. As Sarah signed her name on the marriage certificate, she felt as if she were closing one chapter of her life and opening another entirely. The first few weeks of married life were an adjustment for everyone. Sarah and the children moved into David's house, and suddenly the quiet, orderly space became filled with the noise and chaos of family life. Emma and Jason had to adapt to new bedrooms, new routines, and sharing space with a stepfather they were still getting to know. David proved to be remarkably patient during the transition. When Jason had nightmares about his father, David sat with him until he fell back asleep, never trying to take Mark's place but simply offering comfort. When Emma struggled with homework, David helped her without making her feel stupid or rushed. He seemed to understand instinctively that the children needed time to trust him. The Biggest challenge came 3 weeks after the wedding, when Jason came home from school with a black eye and a story about fighting with a classmate who had called David not his real dad. Sarah's heart broke as she listened to her son defend his new family situation, and she worried that the arrangement was causing him pain rather than providing the stability she had hoped for. David's response surprised her. Instead of being hurt or angry, he sat down with Jason and talked honestly about the situation. "You know what?" David said, gently examining Jason's bruised face. "That kid was right. I'm not your real dad, and I'll never try to be. Your real dad was Mark, and he was a great man who loved you very much. But I can be something different. I can be David, who also loves you and wants to take care of you." This conversation seemed to help Jason understand his place in their new family structure. He stopped trying to defend David as a replacement father and started introducing him to friends simply as "my stepdad David," which felt more honest and comfortable for everyone. Emma's adjustment was different but equally challenging. As the older child, she felt responsible for helping her mother and brother adapt to their new life. She tried so hard to be perfect and helpful that Sarah worried she was losing her childhood to adult concerns. The breakthrough came when David invited Emma to help him with a woodworking project in his shop. He was building a bookshelf for her room, and he genuinely needed her help with measuring and sanding. As they worked together, Emma finally relaxed enough to act like a normal 12-year-old, making mistakes and asking questions without worrying about being a burden. "You know," David said as they worked, "Maria always said that the best way to make a house feel like home was to fill it with things made by the people who lived there. When you help me build this bookshelf, you're making this house more like home for all of us." Sarah's own adjustment was perhaps the most complicated. Living with David felt strange and familiar at the same time. He was considerate and respectful, always knocking before entering rooms and asking permission before making changes to household routines. But she found herself missing the easy intimacy she had shared with Mark, the comfortable silences and unspoken understanding that came from years of marriage. David seemed to sense her struggle. One evening, about a month after their wedding, he found Sarah sitting alone on the front porch looking melancholy. "Are you regretting this?" he asked quietly, settling into the chair beside her. Sarah considered the question carefully. "No," she said finally. "I'm not regretting it. But I'm grieving, I think, not just for Mark, but for the simple life I thought I understood. Everything feels complicated now." David nodded thoughtfully. "I understand that feeling. Sometimes I wake up and forget for just a moment that Maria's gone, and then I remember everything that's changed. But you know what I've noticed? Emma laughs more now than she did when I first met her, and Jason is starting to joke around with me the way kids do when they feel safe. Whatever we're building here, it's good for them." Sarah realized he was right. Her children were thriving in ways she hadn't expected. Emma was learning woodworking and developing confidence in her abilities. Jason was helping David with simple mechanical tasks and discovering that he had a natural aptitude for understanding how things worked. Both children were eating better, sleeping better, and showing less of the anxiety that had plagued them after their father's death. The turning point in Sarah and David's relationship came during their second month of marriage, when David fell ill with a severe case of flu. For 3 days, he was bedridden with fever and barely able to keep food down. Sarah found herself automatically slipping into the role of caretaker, bringing him soup and medicine, checking his temperature, and making sure he stayed hydrated. It wasn't until David was recovering that Sarah realized how naturally she had cared for him, without thinking of him as a stranger or a burden. When he thanked her for nursing him back to health, she found herself saying, "That's what family does for each other." The word family hung in the air between them, and Sarah realized that somewhere along the way, that's what they had become. Not a romantic couple, not a passionate love story, but a family unit bound together by choice and mutual care. David's recovery coincided with an unexpected visitor who would test the strength of their new family bonds. Maria's sister, Carmen, arrived unannounced one afternoon while Sarah was working in the garden and David was in his workshop. Carmen had been traveling for months, dealing with her own grief over her sister's death, and she had come to collect some of Maria's belongings that she wanted to keep. Sarah invited Carmen in for coffee, but the visit quickly became tense. Carmen was clearly shocked to discover that David had remarried so soon after Maria's death, and she made no effort to hide her disapproval. "How could you forget Maria so quickly?" Carmen demanded when David emerged from his workshop. "It's only been 6 months since she died and you're already playing house with someone else." David's face went pale, but his voice remained steady. "I haven't forgotten Maria and I never will. But Sarah and her children needed help, and I needed a reason to keep living. This isn't about forgetting the past, it's about finding a way to move forward." The confrontation might have escalated, but Emma chose that moment to come home from school. She bounded into the house with her usual energy, calling out greetings to Sarah and David before noticing the tension in the room. "Oh," Emma said, looking at Carmen with curiosity rather than hostility. "Are you Maria? Are you related to Maria? David has shown us pictures of her, and you look like her." Carmen's anger seemed to deflate as she looked at Emma's open, friendly face. "I'm Carmen, Maria's sister," she said more gently, "and you must be one of David's new family members." What followed was one of the most important conversations of their marriage. Carmen sat at the kitchen table with Sarah, David, Emma, and Jason, and talked about Maria, her dreams, her personality, her love for David, and her excitement about becoming a mother. Instead of feeling threatened by these memories, Sarah found herself grateful to learn more about the woman whose husband she had married. Maria always said that David had enough love in his heart for a whole house full of children. Carmen told Emma and Jason she would be happy to know that he's using that love to take care of you. By the time Carmen left the next day, she had given her blessing to David's new marriage and had helped everyone understand that honoring Maria's memory didn't require David to remain alone forever. She took a few precious keepsakes with her, but she also left behind Maria's recipe collection and her gardening journals, saying that they belonged with the family that was now living in Maria's house. That evening, as Sarah prepared dinner using one of Maria's recipes, she realized that she no longer felt like an intruder in another woman's home. Instead, she felt like she was continuing a legacy of family life that Maria had begun, and that she and David were now building together in their own way. 6 months into their marriage, Sarah and David had settled into a comfortable routine that worked for their blended family. The children were thriving in their new environment, with Emma excelling in her woodworking projects and Jason developing a genuine passion for helping David with mechanical repairs. The financial stress that had plagued Sarah for months had disappeared, replaced by a sense of security she hadn't felt since Mark's death. But it was during this period of stability that David's carefully guarded secret began to surface in ways that would ultimately threaten everything they had built together. The first sign came when David received an unexpected phone call on a Tuesday evening in late fall. Sarah was helping Emma with homework at the kitchen table when she noticed David's face go pale as he spoke quietly into the phone. He stepped outside to continue the conversation, and when he returned 20 minutes later, he appeared shaken. "Everything okay?" Sarah asked, noting the tension in his shoulders. "Just some old business I need to take care of," David replied, but his usual openness had been replaced by an evasiveness that Sarah hadn't seen before. "Nothing to worry about." Over the next few weeks, similar phone calls arrived regularly, always sending David outside for private conversations that left him distracted and anxious. Sarah began to notice other changes too. David started checking the mailbox obsessively and would sometimes disappear for hours without explanation, saying only that he had errands to run. The situation came to a head when Sarah discovered David burning a stack of letters behind the workshop one evening. The flames had already consumed most of the documents, but she caught a glimpse of official-looking letterhead and what appeared to be legal documents. "David, what are you burning?" she asked directly, her voice carrying a firmness that surprised them both. David froze, staring at the small fire he had built. For a long moment, he didn't answer. Then he slowly turned to face her, and Sarah saw fear in his eyes for the first time since she had known him. "There are some things about my past that I haven't told you," he said quietly. "Things that happened before Maria died, before we got married. I thought they were behind me, but apparently they're not." Sarah felt her stomach drop. "What kind of things?" David kicked dirt over the fire, extinguishing the last of the flames. "Can we go inside? I think it's time I told you everything." They sat at the kitchen table while Emma and Jason watched television in the living room, their innocent laughter providing a stark contrast to the serious conversation unfolding nearby. David began his story haltingly, clearly struggling with how much to reveal. When I was 18, he said, I made some very stupid choices. I got involved with some guys who were dealing drugs on the reservation. Nothing major, mostly just marijuana and some pills. But it was illegal and it was wrong. Sarah listened without interrupting, though her heart was racing. This was not what she had expected to hear. I only did it for about 6 months, David continued. I was young and broke and thought it was easy money. But then a friend of mine got arrested and I realized how serious the consequences could be. I stopped immediately and stayed away from those guys. Did you get arrested? Sarah asked. No, I was lucky. But the thing is, some of the people I worked with back then have been in and out of prison over the years. And recently, one of them got released and has been trying to contact me. David explained that his former associate, a man named Rick Torres, had been imprisoned for drug trafficking and had served 8 years of a 12-year sentence. Rick had been released on parole 3 months ago and had apparently been looking for David ever since. What does he want? Sarah asked, though she was afraid to hear the answer. Money, mostly. He claims I owe him from the old days, which isn't true. But he's also threatening to cause trouble for me if I don't help him get back into business. He knows I'm married now and he knows about you and the kids. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Is he dangerous? David hesitated before answering. He can be. Rick always had a violent streak even when we were teenagers. Prison probably didn't make him any gentler. The full implications of the situation began to sink in for Sarah. She had married David to provide stability and safety for her children, and now it seemed that his past might bring exactly the opposite into their lives. Why didn't you tell me about this before we got married? She asked, trying to keep her voice level despite her growing panic. Because I honestly thought it was over, David replied. It happened 15 years ago, Sarah. I've been clean ever since. I've never been arrested and I haven't had contact with any of those people in over a decade. I thought they were all either dead or in prison permanently. But now this Rick person is out and threatening our family. He's threatening me, not you or the kids, and I'm not going to let him hurt anyone. Sarah stood up and began pacing around the kitchen, her mind racing through all the potential consequences of this revelation. David, if this man is dangerous and he knows where we live, then he is threatening my children. Do you understand that? David's face crumpled with guilt and fear. Sarah, I'm so sorry. I never meant for any of this to touch you or Emma and Jason. I'll handle it, I promise. I'll find a way to make Rick leave us alone. How? By giving him money? By helping him with whatever illegal scheme he's planning? No, absolutely not. I'll never go back to that life. Sarah stopped pacing and looked directly at David. Then what exactly are you planning to do? Before David could answer, Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway. Mom, is everything okay? You guys sound upset. Sarah forced a smile and spoke in her normal voice. We're just discussing some adult business, sweetheart. Nothing for you to worry about. Emma looked skeptical but didn't press the issue. After she returned to the living room, Sarah lowered her voice and continued the conversation. We need to figure this out together, she said. No more secrets, no more hiding things from me. If we're going to be partners in this marriage, then I need to know everything. David nodded gratefully. You're right. I should have told you from the beginning. Over the next hour, David provided more details about his brief involvement in drug dealing as a teenager and his subsequent efforts to build a clean life. He had worked hard to distance himself from that world, focusing on his education, his job, and his relationship with Maria. The past had seemed truly buried until Rick's release from prison had brought it roaring back to life. The calls and letters have been getting more frequent, David admitted. Rick is getting impatient and he's starting to make more specific threats. He's mentioned our address, your children's names, even the fact that you're a widow who remarried quickly. Sarah felt sick. The idea that a dangerous stranger knew intimate details about her family was terrifying. How does he know so much about us? Small community. People talk. And Rick always was good at gathering information when he wanted something. That night after the children were asleep, Sarah and David stayed up until nearly dawn discussing their options. They could go to the police, but David was concerned that his past involvement with drugs might complicate matters, especially since he had never been formally charged or convicted. They could try to ignore Rick's threats and hope he would eventually give up and move on, or they could consider the most drastic option, leaving their home and starting over somewhere else. None of the choices seemed good. Each carried significant risks for their family's safety and stability. As Sarah finally headed to bed in the early morning hours, she realized that the secure life she had thought she was building for her children might be an illusion. David's secret had the potential to destroy everything they had worked to create together. But what troubled her most was not just the external threat that Rick represented. It was the realization that the man she had married, the man she had trusted with her children's welfare, had kept something this significant hidden from her. If David could conceal his involvement with drugs and dangerous people, what other secrets might he be keeping? As she lay in bed listening to David's quiet breathing in the room next to hers, Sarah wondered if she had made a terrible mistake in trusting their family's future to someone whose past was more complicated and dangerous than she had ever imagined. The crisis reached its peak 2 weeks later when Rick Torres showed up at their house while David was at work and the children were at school. Sarah was alone in the kitchen preparing lunch when she heard an unfamiliar truck pull into their driveway. Looking out the window, she saw a man in his 40s with prison tattoos covering his arms stepping out of a rusted pickup truck. Even before he knocked on the door, Sarah knew this had to be Rick. Everything about him radiated the kind of dangerous energy that made her instinctively want to protect her family. When he knocked, she didn't answer, hoping he would assume no one was home and leave. Instead, he walked around the house, peering in windows and calling out. "I know someone's in there," Rick said loudly. "I just want to talk to David's pretty new wife." Sarah's hand shook as she reached for her cell phone to call David. But before she could dial, Rick appeared at the kitchen window, grinning at her through the glass. His smile was cold and calculating, and Sarah realized he had no intention of leaving without getting what he wanted. Against her better judgment, Sarah opened the back door but kept the screen door locked between them. "David isn't here," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "You'll have to come back another time." "That's okay, sweetheart. I came to talk to you anyway." Rick's voice was superficially friendly, but his eyes were hard and threatening. "See, your husband has been avoiding my calls, and I think maybe he needs some motivation to remember his old obligations." "I don't know what you're talking about," Sarah replied, though they both knew she was lying. Rick laughed, a sound that made Sarah's skin crawl. "Oh, I think you do. David probably told you some sob story about how he used to run with a bad crowd, but he's all reformed now. What he probably didn't tell you is that he owes me money from the old days, and now that I'm out of prison, I've come to collect." Even if that were true, which I doubt, David and I keep our finances separate. I can't help you, but you could motivate him to help me. Rick pressed his face closer to the screen door. "You see, I know all about your little arrangement. Widow lady marries Indian boy for his family's money. Very practical. But what would happen if word got around about David's criminal past? What would the tribal council think? What would your children's school think? What would the bank think?" Sarah felt trapped and terrified, but she forced herself to stand her ground. "You need to leave, now. I'll leave when David agrees to meet with me properly. Tell him I'll be at Murphy's bar tomorrow night at 9 o'clock. If he doesn't show up, I'll start making some very interesting phone calls about his past." After Rick drove away, Sarah immediately called David at work. Her voice was shaking so badly that he could barely understand her at first. But when she explained what had happened, David left work immediately and drove home. "I'm so sorry," David said over and over as he held Sarah in the kitchen where she had confronted Rick. "I should have anticipated this. I should have done something to prevent it." "What exactly could you have done?" Sarah asked. "And more importantly, what are we going to do now?" David was quiet for a long time, clearly wrestling with difficult decisions. Finally, he looked at Sarah with an expression of grim determination. "I'm going to meet with him tomorrow night, but not to give him what he wants. I'm going to tell him that if he ever comes near our family again, I'll go to the police and tell them everything I know about his current activities." "David, that sounds incredibly dangerous." "What if he becomes violent?" "I'll meet him in a public place and I'll make sure Thomas knows where I am and when to expect me back." "But Sarah, this has to end. I won't let him terrorize our family." That evening, after Emma and Jason were in bed, Sarah and David had the most honest conversation of their marriage. David told her everything about his past involvement with drugs, holding nothing back this time. He explained how young and desperate he had been, how the easy money had seemed like a solution to his family's financial problems, and how quickly he had realized the danger he was putting himself in. "The thing is," David said, "Rick is lying about me owing him money. If anything, he owes me. I got out of the business clean, but he kept using information about our customers to extort people long after I was gone. He's desperate now because he has no legitimate way to make money, and he thinks he can intimidate me into helping him restart his operation." Sarah listened to everything David told her, and while she was hurt that he had kept these secrets initially, she found herself believing his version of events. The David she had come to know over the past 8 months was fundamentally honest and decent. His teenage mistakes seemed consistent with the grief and desperation that had driven many of his recent decisions, including their marriage. "What happens if we can't make him go away?" Sarah asked. "What if he keeps threatening us?" "Then we'll have to consider leaving," David said quietly. "I know that's not what you want to hear, but I won't let him destroy what we've built. If necessary, we can sell both properties and start over somewhere else." The thought of uprooting Emma and Jason again, just when they had found stability, was heartbreaking to Sarah. But she realized that their current situation was unsustainable if Rick continued his threats. The next night, David met Rick at Murphy's bar as requested. Sarah waited at home with the children, her stomach in knots and her phone ready to call for help if David didn't return by midnight. Thomas Crowfeather had positioned himself discreetly in the bar's parking lot, ready to intervene if the situation escalated. David returned home at 11:30 with a split lip and bruised knuckles, but also with news that surprised Sarah. The confrontation had indeed become physical, but it had ended when other patrons in the bar intervened, and Rick had been escorted out by the bartender. More importantly, David had learned something crucial about Rick's situation. "He's not just threatening me," David explained as Sarah cleaned his cut lip. "He's trying the same intimidation tactics with several other people from the old days. Apparently, his parole officer has been asking questions about his activities, and he's getting desperate to come up with money quickly." David had managed to convince Rick that pursuing their family was a dead end, both because David had no money to give him and because any attempt to harm Sarah or the children would result in serious legal consequences that Rick couldn't afford to face while on parole. "I think he believed me," David said, "but I also think we need to be prepared for him to try something else." The resolution came 3 days later in a way none of them had anticipated. Rick Torres was arrested for violating his parole after being caught trying to sell drugs to an undercover police officer. The arrest occurred during a sting operation that had been planned for weeks, completely unrelated to David or their family situation. When Thomas called with the news, Sarah felt as if a massive weight had been lifted from her shoulders. Rick would be returned to prison to serve the remainder of his original sentence, plus additional time for the parole violation. The immediate threat to their family was over, but the crisis had changed something fundamental in Sarah and David's relationship. The secrets and lies that had hidden David's past were now completely in the open, and they had weathered the storm together. More importantly, Sarah had seen how David handled the threat when it materialized, not by running away or by compromising his principles, but by standing up to protect their family, even when it put him in physical danger. That night, for the first time since their wedding 8 months earlier, Sarah knocked on David's bedroom door and asked if she could come in. They talked until dawn about everything, their fears, their hopes, their gratitude for having survived the crisis together.